I started quilting back in 2009 and I was so excited and eager to get started. But I kind of rushed into things and wasn't quite sure of some of the fundamentals and basics that I needed to know as a quilter. There are quite a few things that I'd love to be able to go back and tell my past self, wait, stop, do this first. So in this video I'm going to be talking about 7 things that I wish I had known as a beginning quilter. And make sure you stay tuned to the end because I have a bonus 8th tip for you. Hi, I'm Tom from How to Quilt and I want to help you love quilting as much as I do. I publish regular videos that are going to help you get started if you're a beginner or improve the skills that you already have. Before we get started, let's just take a moment to hit that subscribe button, click the little bell so that you get notified when I release more videos. I've always had the love of making things and I've always been quite creative, having sewn from an early age. I've tried my hand at many things, including making cakes, baking, cooking, even trying soap making. But the one thing I've always stuck with is quilting, which I've always loved from the minute that I started. In 2009 I decided when I started quilting I was going to make a baby blanket. Not really knowing what to do, I bought some fabric, bought a cutter and a mat, didn't have a ruler, sat down, chopped things up, used a piece of wood as a ruler and sewed together a really kind of basic square baby blanket. But there were a lot of things that weren't right in that, and so I took to the internet and searched and found Missouri Star Quilt Company's tutorials and watched them all in a weekend. And I learned so many things that helped me, so I went out, I bought more fabric and started again using the skills that I had learned in that video and came up with something that was slightly better. After that, I was ready to make a quilt for my house. We lived in a 110-year-old flat that was quite drafty, so I wanted something that was cozy for night times in the winter to keep us warm. So I found an online sew-along that made a sampler quilt with 12 different blocks. I actually made 14 blocks because there was 2 other blocks that I saw separately on the internet that I really liked, and I picked my 12 for the quilt. As quilters, I think we never stop learning. It's like anything that we do. You know, I'm also a singer. I never stop learning better ways to sing and better technique to help my voice. And quilting is exactly the same. So let's get straight into these 7 tips. So the first thing I didn't realise was that 1/4 inch seams were crucial to sewing. I just kind of winged it, flung things through the sewing machine, kind of paying attention to some sort of seam, not really, so therefore my seams were quite inconsistent. Blocks were different sizes, they were different shapes, seams were squint, they just kind of went like this. So that 1/4 inch seam is really important when you're following a pattern. Imagine you have a quilt that has 5 blocks by 7 blocks. And every block is out by 1/8 of an inch. That soon adds up across the width and the length of the quilt. Not only that, but it wastes fabric because then if you want to make it look and sit properly, you've got to trim all that fabric down, which wastes that fabric. Accurate seams make quilt blocks look crisp and sharp. Let's face it, nobody wants a quilt block that looks like it's been made on a roller coaster. So what can we do to get some accurate quilt seams? Firstly, have some of the right tools, and that doesn't mean that you need to spend hundreds of dollars to get the right tools. There are a couple of basic things that will get you started. 1/4 inch foot for your sewing machine is a great start. From the needle to the edge of the foot is a 1/4 inch, and that will help you to get that right. And all you do is line your fabric up along the edge of the foot as you sew. That can be kind of tricky though to keep it straight, so having some kind of secondary seam guide can be really helpful. Some sewing machines have a clip-on guide like this, and this can be used to run the fabric along that, and it helps to keep it straight. Other sewing machines have little clips that go at the side of the foot that can be used to help keep it straight. It just depends on what kind of sewing machine you have. But if you don't want to spend any money, you can use masking tape, as we call it in the UK, or painter's tape as they call it in the US, and create a seam ledge by stacking up layers of masking tape and then putting it alongside your foot. One thing to do though is if you do buy a 1/4 inch foot is to actually physically measure it and make sure that it is accurate. The first foot I ever bought for my sewing machine was a compatible foot. It wasn't made by Singer and it was actually a little bit out, so I had to manually move my needle to get the correct 1/4 inch seam. Also, using the right weight of thread can help with an accurate 1/4 inch seam. Using a thread that's too thick can eat into the seam and it can make the seam smaller or too big depending on which way you're out. But really, don't just hope for the best, set yourself up for success, get a couple of things that work for you and then you'll have better seams. And of course, practicing lots of sewing will help make them accurate as well. I actually learned this from a joiner, or a carpenter as you call it in the US, and it was always that when you're cutting anything, to avoid wastage and avoid mistakes, is that you measure it twice and then cut it. Don't just measure and then cut it. Now, I did actually make a huge mistake when I was making a quilt once. I cut strips for the pattern from half a yard of fabric, and I cut the strips a 1/4 inch too small. Now that doesn't seem like much, but because I wasn't very experienced as a quilter, I then didn't know how to alter the rest of my pattern to use those strips. So those strips ended up going into my stash and not getting used, and I had to reorder that fabric. And the fabric was out of stock, so I had to wait 6 weeks before I could finish that part of the quilt. And it was a stupid mistake, and it was all because I didn't check twice before I cut. So when you're cutting your strips or whatever it is, get yourself ready, get it all measured up, check it, then check it again, and then cut. And that will save you a lot of wasted fabric. This was something I did not know at all as a beginning quilter, was to maintain my sewing machine. First of all, though, when you are buying a sewing machine, if you don't already have one, is do some research. Don't just go on YouTube and see the people that are sponsored by various brands who say get this, get that. What you really need to do is go to a shop, sit down, try a couple of sewing machines out, see which one you like, see which one fits you and fits with your budget. But don't just buy something because somebody on YouTube says, this is shiny, buy it. And the thing to remember is that you might not need a $10,000 sewing machine to start. You may only need a $500 sewing machine, but you can always trade that sewing machine in later and get something with more features once you're more experienced. So start realistically doing your homework, going to a dealership, finding something that you like and working with it, and then getting some training on it on how to maintain it. So for every 8 hours of sewing, you should be changing your needle in your sewing machine. I did not know this. I made like 4, 5, 6, 7 quilts using the same needle. So make sure after every 8 hours of sewing that you change your needle. A lot of people will say that when they start a new project, they just change needle. That little bottle of oil that comes with your sewing machine is not just for decoration, it's actually for oiling the machine. And that's really important for the smooth running of your sewing machine. Now my sewing machine, when it starts to need oil, gets louder and louder and louder until I eventually oil it, and then it starts to purr again. So again, same rule, for every 8 hours of sewing you want to oil that sewing machine, and each sewing machine is different and has the different places that it needs to be oiled. So refer to your user's manual for where you should oil it. Using too much oil can also be a problem as well, so make sure you use exactly what it says in the manual. They also say that if you haven't used your sewing machine for a couple of days, you should oil it before you sit down as well. So that's the kind of rules that I follow. Every 8 hours, a couple of drops of oil where my manual tells me to. If I haven't sewn for a few days, I just oil before I get started. And it just keeps the machine running smoothly with no friction, and it keeps the stitches regular and correct. Cleaning fluff out of your sewing machine. That batting or wadding in those quilts produces tons of fluff, not to mention all the fluff that comes out of the fabrics as well. So getting a little brush, most sewing machines come with the brush, or you can buy brushes online, or you can use makeup brushes. Cleaning the bobbin case, cleaning under the stitch plate, and any other places in your sewing machine, depending on what model you have that need clean, just take a brush and just brush that fluff out and get rid of it. Finally, with the sewing machine, make sure you get it serviced every year. That's so important. My sewing machine behind me, I didn't know to service it. I didn't service it for the first 5 years of its life. It had a bent hook that was actually causing problems and causing the stitches to be wrong. As soon as I got it serviced, it was much better. So make sure you service it on a regular basis, and make sure you register your warranty. It can be very tempting to turn that speed dial all the way up and sew at 100% speed on your sewing machine. In my case, my sewing machine stitches at 1,000 stitches per minute, and I cannot keep up with that. It's very difficult for me to accurately feed the pieces of whatever it is I'm sewing through at that speed, and most often I end up making mistakes that have to be unpicked and re-sewn. If you make mistakes by sewing too fast, you just end up becoming best friends with your seam ripper, and there's nothing more monotonous than sitting picking out hundreds of stitches when you're at 15 stitches per inch. It takes forever, it's boring, I hate it. So you don't want to be feeling like you have to keep up with the sewing machine at the speed that it's going. You want the sewing machine to keep up with the speed that you're going. So set your speed where you feel comfortable, and then if that's okay, you can increase it a little bit until you feel where you're in a space where you can accurately piece things through without feeling like you're at that machine as it's pulling things away from you. So take your time, turn the speed down, increase the speed as you get more and more comfortable and more experienced. For me, generally, I set my sewing machine around 50% when I'm piecing things. If it's something that I'm really not sure about, or if something is really tricky, I turn that speed all the way down. But yeah, take your time, do it right, don't unpick it. When I started off, I had a tiny little mat, and I was trying to fold and cut big pieces of fabric, and I was always ending up with elbows and weird wobbly bits in the middle of my strips. And it was because I was trying to cut through more layers of fabric than I could carefully handle. So now I have a bigger mat that allows me to put fabric out, folded in half selvage to selvage, and then I'm only cutting through 2 layers of fabric, which makes it much easier for me to handle. With the right ruler, you can also find that it's easier to cut. When I started, I used 14-inch square up ruler for cutting everything, which was ridiculous because it was twice twice the size of my mat. And it was very difficult to get things lining up and measured and cut properly because it was way too big for cutting small things and it wasn't quite the right shape for cutting strips and things. So for me, I have a 6.5 inch wide by 24 inch ruler, and that covers the entire width of my cutting mat. So that means I can cut strips without having to reposition the ruler. I have a smaller 6.5 by 12 inch ruler, and that's great for trimming blocks or trimming smaller strips. I have a couple of different sizes of square up rulers. The most common sizes, I have like a 3 inch, a 5 inch, and they're really helpful for me. And then I have my 14 inch one still. And then for cutting 2.5 inch strips, I have a 2.5 inch by 18 inch ruler, which is great because it's really easy to cut strips using that ruler. But again, don't feel that you have to buy all of these rulers because somebody on YouTube is telling you that you have to buy them. Buy the rulers that you think will work for you. You don't need hundreds of different rulers. You only need a couple of really good rulers that do a couple of different things, and that will make it easier for you to cut. And it also makes it easier for you to cut accurately. And sometimes some of the rulers have non-stick coatings on the back so that the fabric doesn't slip. Other times you need to get tape and dots that you can put on the back of the ruler and will stop it slipping. And that's really handy for accurate cutting because if the ruler slips and you haven't realized as you're cutting, you end up with a wonky strip. So one thing that I actually did right as a beginning quilter was I started small and worked my way up in size. I started with a little baby quilt that was maybe 30 inches by 20 inches, so a rectangle. Really small, really manageable, easy to handle, and not lots and lots of fabric to waste if I had screwed it up completely. Bigger quilts have more quirks and issues that you have to deal with. They're also a lot bulkier, so they're a lot harder to move around through your sewing machine as you put the top together and then as you sit down to quilt it. It's harder and harder to handle, which means things can go wrong. It's very easy for the fabric to get pulled to one side as you're sewing and then you end up with squint lines. Bigger quilts require more fabric, they require more batting, and they require more backing fabric. So all in all, your investment in making that quilt is more. So if you make a mistake or you screw things up, it's a lot more fabric to waste. And yes, you can probably salvage it and make something else from it, but it's a lot of money to invest when you don't really quite know what you're doing yet. So start small, experiment with a couple of things. You can make half-size versions of bigger quilts, and then once you've got an idea for what you're doing, then you can start to get into bigger quilts. As a beginning quilter, my skill levels didn't quite match up to what I pictured in my head of my finished blocks looking like, and that created a lot of stress and anxiety for me. I was so obsessed by perfect seams, matching corners, things turning out exactly the right size, that it actually took the joy out of quilting for a period of time. It's so easy to get obsessed by matching this and matching that, and oh, that didn't match, unpick it and unpick it. And actually, I found sometimes when I was unpicking things to resew it, I was actually ripping the fabric with the seam ripper and then ending up having to cut and start all over again and wasting fabric. So don't sweat the small stuff. Do the best that you can. And let's face it, you're probably going to be the only one that notices that mistake that you think is standing out like a sore thumb, but anybody else will be like, I don't see anything, it looks fine to me. When you're a beginning quilter, there's so many things that you're learning to do. You're learning to cut fabric, sew seams, press, put it all back together to make a big quilt top, sandwich it together, quilting it, binding it, all of that stuff is a lot to take in. And if you then add on the worry of obsessing with matching seams and matching points and everything being perfect, then you probably will not get very far. Everything gets better with practice. And as I said, you might make it worse by trying to correct it. So don't worry if it's not perfect, if it doesn't look like the picture on Instagram or the pattern that you bought, it's okay. You can try unpicking it and doing it again if you want, but chances are nobody's going to see it, so don't sweat the small stuff. So it's time for that bonus tip, but before we do, remember to hit that subscribe button and click the bell so you get notified when I release more great videos like this. When I started out, I didn't know that I was supposed to set seams and then press blocks. I just sewed, opened, and then sewed, and then opened, and so things were not right. When I did find out about pressing and ironing, it seemed like, oh, it's an unnecessary step. I don't need to do that. I was wrong. Ironing makes your blocks turn out the right size, and it does this by making sure that you're fully opening the seams that are joining the two bits of fabric together. And what that does is it makes sure that they're the right size, it alleviates any distortion or wonkiness that you might have, and helps you get closer to the actual finished size of the block. Setting the stitches, which is where you take the iron and press it on top of the seam and just hold it there with maybe perhaps a little blast of steam, is really important. It helps the stitches to meld together, which in turn forms a stronger seam which holds the fabric together better. But you're not ironing a bed sheet here, you're not in every direction. You're pressing a quilt block, and doing that can distort it and can make it go out of shape, so you have to be very careful. Gently press and along the seams and with the grains of the fabric. As soon as you start going diagonally, you're on the bias of the fabric and that can stretch the block out of shape. What you can do as well is once you've set the seam is that you can open the block and finger press it to make sure that it's going in the right direction before you then press it with the iron, and that can be great if you're not quite sure if you're pressing in the right direction. And most irons have a tip on them, so you can use that to get right into the seam to make sure that it's fully opened. And hopefully by pressing and setting your seams, you'll find that your quilt blocks start to turn out more accurate and the seams hold together better. So that's it for today. Those are my 7 tips for beginning quilters that I wish I had known when I had started quilting that would have made my life so much easier. There are plenty of other things that I think about as well out there, but these are the things that I think are the most important. But what's one thing that you maybe wish you had known when you started quilting? You maybe look back now and think, oh, it's so obvious, but perhaps to other people it's not. So leave a comment down below and let others know what one thing you wish you had known when you started quilting. And don't forget, if you found this video useful, please like it, subscribe and click the bell to get notifications, and I'll see you in the next video.